Welcome all. Thank you for joining us today. This is quite an auspicious occasion, notwithstanding the really interesting subject we've got today. Today happens to be the first joint presentation by both the Australian Jewish Genealogical Society in Sydney and the Australian Jewish Genealogical Society here in Melbourne. And I'm going to hand over to Terry to introduce Jeff, but on behalf of the Victorian branch and the New South Wales branch, the Sydney branch, I'd like to welcome you all here today and enjoy the presentation.
Today's Zoom presentation on the digitising of Hobart Synagogue's archives is presented by Jeff Schneider, who is the president of the Hobart Hebrew congregation. Jeff created this digital archive during the COVID lockdown of 2020. The archive consists of 1,800 plus records, which includes details relating to birth, marriage and death records. So welcome, Jeff.
All right, so thank you for attending this session about the Hobart Synagogue's Digital Archives, and also thank you to the AJGS giving me the opportunity to present. There's lots of fun and interesting stories in this collection, and I look forward to sharing. As I am speaking from Hobart, I pay respect to the traditional and original owners of this land, the Meena people, and I pay respect to those that have passed before us and to acknowledge today's Tasmanian Aboriginal people who are custodians of this land. Now first, a little about me. Hopefully the sound quality on your end is good enough so that you have already been able to tell that I'm not from Tassie originally. I've been in Hobart about 8 years now, after living the previous part of my life in America. I'm the president of the Hobart Hebrew congregation and love living here in Tassie, love our little community, and obviously love our history as well. Professionally, I help institutions build and manage online collections using my background in web development and library science. So here is an old photo of our synagogue. Now, an overview of the session. My presentation should take around 50 minutes. And first, we'll explore the digital collection, why it was created, how it was created, and most importantly, what is there. Then I'll spend the majority of the presentation highlighting objects in the collection that tell some of the more compelling, funny, and even contentious stories found in the records that help us understand this tiny Jewish community in Tasmania. And I ask that you save your questions until the end, where we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So we're fortunate to have several congregational records that go back all the way to the 1840s. Some time ago, we handed them over to the Tasmanian State Archives to be the custodian of the records. And a couple years ago, in 2020, before the synagogue's 175th anniversary, we approached the State Archives asking if they could digitize our records, and they were very glad to do so. So now we now have all sorts of records available online, meeting minutes, congregation, birth, death, and marriage records, letters, and much more. So this is a picture of an example of our congregation's birth records that start in 1844. Now, in the 1840s, they had a version of the spreadsheet that, if you take a look at it, it's not really all that different than the format we use today, other than it was written on paper. But as you can see, there's columns and rows. So you can currently retrieve and download this document from the State Archives online. And it's great that the State Archives put these birth records online. It's certainly an improvement from before, where you had to physically go into the Hobart archives to access the records. But what happens if you wanted the results in clear transcribed text, or do a quick search to find a person's record, or search by date, or group records together by a person or event, or link to their family members? So enter a digital collection with metadata fields, a searchable catalog, and the ability to link related records. So here is an example of a marriage record object in the collection. Now we have over here an expandable thumbnail image of the original document. And on the right, we have the metadata fields. As you can see, title, wedding date, groom, bride, officiant, and the location. So collective access is the open software I use, and it's very flexible in that it allows you to create whatever metadata fields you like. So for marriage records, there's fields such as groom and bride and officiant, not exactly standard metadata fields, but as I said, the software lets you do whatever you want, basically. So when you click on the name of a groom or the bride or the officiant, you go to that, what I call a person record, where you can see the associated data related to that person. Now, newspaper articles are a core component of the collection. There's about 700 newspaper articles about Hobart's Jewish community dating from 1828 to the present. Almost all of them were found through Trove, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And back to the Hobart Synagogue Archive, you can see here the faceted browsing in the catalog. The user has filtered the objects displayed to newspaper articles in the 1940s. And the objects are displayed with a preview image that could be clicked on to see the full record. And on the right side of the screen here, we have related facets where you could filter more by person, event, topic, or even place. So as I said, collective access is the software used for the Hobart Synagogue records. And I love looking at other online collections. Here's an example. I just took a screenshot of collective access that was used for a family history collection. You could see the collection features record types such as census records, maps, obituaries, photos, headstones. And yeah, I suppose this gives you a bit more robust organization and a customized presentation compared to, a site like Ancestry.com. So going back to the Hobart Synagogue records, we also have an extensive collection of the congregation's Meena minutes. And here's an image of our very first Meena minute in 1841, 12 December to be specific. Now, you may ask, what does it say? And looking at these old documents is fun, but sometimes making out handwriting from nearly 180 years ago takes a bit of time. So here is that very first meaning, and as you can see on the right, we have a transcription. So for each minute, we offer a transcription, and this was done as part of the COVID lockdown in 2020. And once the State Archive scanned all the meeting minutes, I put out a call for volunteer transcriptionists. And much to my amazement, in a little more than a month, we had about 250 meeting minutes transcribed. Now, it's been a couple years now, but I do recall that some of the volunteers were from the AJGS. And if any of the volunteers are here today, thank you. So in the digital collection, whenever you're viewing an original meeting minute document, you can see the related transcription just side by side. And now I'm going to jump out of my presentation a bit and share, walk through an example of what's on the online collection. Just let me get the screen sharing thing right. So here we are. You should be able to see the actual on the collection online. And we are going to take a look at a person record, and we're going to look, as an example, we're going to look at Priscilla Levy, lived in the 19th century, and as an example, a little bit just showing how you can navigate through the online collection. So we will start by searching, going to the search people link. And this is a rather straightforward form. So as I said, her name was Priscilla Levy, so I'll just put Levy as a surname. And you can search birth date, and we'll just put it in as being in the 19th century. So we press search, and now we have, as you may expect, there's quite a lot of Levys in this collection. So we'll scroll down a bit. And here is the one we're after, Priscilla Levy. So you click on her name, and now you could see her person record.
Fantastic.
And then, so again, this metadata field showing her basic birth date, birthplace, death date, death place. And by default, we're showing the maiden name, but as you can see here, she got married, so her married name is Priscilla Goldwright. We have her birth, marriage, and if she had a death record here, it would be there. So let's take a look at her birth record. So again, basic metadata on the right, showing her parents. First, we'll take a look at the actual congregation record. Now I'll make this a bit bigger. And so this is on the spreadsheet type thing I was explaining before, but we have this handy green arrow that points to Priscilla's.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Sure, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so we have her Hebrew name here. I'm gonna be ask if anyone is able to do transcription of Hebrew. Certainly get in touch with me because I could use some help with that. So we have her Hebrew name, and then Priscilla's name, and then her parents' name in Hebrew, and then you can see her parents are Philip and Mary Levy, and we have her Hebrew date of birth, and then the English date of birth. So let me get out of that. And again, there's her parents on the right, which we'll look at soon. And we also have a link to the State Archives record, which I'll quickly click on that. And so this takes you to the Tasmanian State Archives. I mean, a lot of the information is the same, but I thought it would be handy to include this information. Takes a little bit to load, but you can see here, this is I guess you can call the secular birth record for Priscilla Levy. It's one of the rows here. We won't get into that, but
It's Philip Levy.
yeah. So we go back here to Priscilla's birth record, and I'll go back to her main person page. We also have her marriage record. So she married Israel Morris Goldwright, who he actually served as minister for the Hobart Hebrew congregation. But first, we'll just take a quick look at the actual, with the birth record, you can bring up the original record and then expand that, and you can see various details of the officiant and where it was. And I guess something that I didn't catalog is you could see here that Leo Sussman was a witness. So there's a little more information on the original document that hasn't been fully cataloged, but. And as I said before, the names, if you just click on that, then you could see more about her husband, Israel Morris Goldwright, and his birth and death information. You can see he died. So after serving in the Hobart, after marrying Priscilla and serving at the Hobart Hebrew congregation, they went off to Ballarat, where he was the minister for the Ballarat synagogue. And there's a little biography for him. He married Priscilla Levy, daughter of congregation president Philip Levy. So yeah, you can click all around and find out all about her life. So we go back to Priscilla's record. Now I should say here that we actually don't have an example of a person that has birth, marriage, and death records all within the congregation, due to various factors, such as where historically the congregation has been a rather transient group and rather small, people moving around. So we don't have that golden person that, has their whole life cycle within congregation records, but this is fairly close. So we'll take a look, and her father, Philip Levy, he served as congregation president and treasurer for many years. Here we have a biography of him that of course mentions the fact that it's Priscilla married the minister of the congregation. And so Philip, her father, was one of the original founding members of the congregation. And unlike many of the others who either went back to England or other places in Australia, Philip stayed in Hobart for a while. He did go to Melbourne in the 1870s. He died in Carlton, I believe, on Drummond Street, is where his last residence was. And Philip and his wife Mary, they did pretty well. They had, what is that, 12 children, I think? No, 9. And so Priscilla's mother is Mary Moses. And we see some information about her. Her father, so this is Priscilla's grandfather, was Emmanuel Money Moses, who you may be familiar with the attempted gold dust robbery in England. And Emmanuel Moses was involved with that, and he got sent to Tasmania for his crime. And here you could see, I mean, you can even see, so this would be Priscilla's grandmother, Sarah, and Mary was her mom, and these, I suppose, would be her aunties, Rachel and Rebecca. So yeah, there's a lot of exploring you can do. You can find out a lot about person. So now go all the way back to Priscilla. We'll take a look. Now, as I said, so her and Israel Morris Goldwright, they moved to Ballarat, where Israel Morris served as the minister. But in Trove, and actually in the local newspaper here, the Mercury, there was an article about her death, which was in 1883. We'll make that a bit bigger. And as you could see, she was in Ballarat. She was on a train, and she had been sick for a while, but it got critical, and she must have been a pretty prominent member of Ballarat, given that there were 4 doctors attending to her. There was a telegram sent to her mom, as we know, it's Mary Moses. And as I said, they were residing on Drummond Street in Carlton. Tragically, she arrived, but not in time to say goodbye. Priscilla died a little past 10 o'clock. Some very specific information here. And the connection to Hobart is given. The sad event will no doubt cast a gloom over a large circle of acquaintances in Ballarat, Melbourne, Geelong, and Hobart. 40 years old, and mentions that her father Philip recently died, and talks a bit about her brothers. And it also, interestingly, I want to point out, it says that they had 7 children. Now, going back to Priscilla's record, in the records here, they often show children, but they're not listed here, and I just wanted to point that out. So, there are family records listed, but if there's, like, for example here, if their children were not listed in the congregation birth records, they're not listed here in this collection. And I do have notes in various places throughout the collection where, this shouldn't be, the synagogue's collection should not be looked at like as you would Ancestry. It's not family tree software. It's limited, the scope is limited to the congregation records. So in this example, we're not listing our children because the congregation, that they had already moved to Ballarat. The congregation records do not have their children. But so it's not meant to be taken as a definitive, this is her full family tree. It's just what the congregation has. So I think that's about it. I just wanted to show that to give you an example of how you can navigate throughout the system. So I will stop sharing this screen and go back to the presentation. So now that we've completed a brief overview of the collection set up, let's take a look at the content of the collection, which tells the story, and of course, the stories of the congregation. And of course, we'll start with the very early days of the Jewish community. So what is the first thing a Jewish community does even before forming a congregation or creating a synagogue? Let's establish burial ground. Fittingly, the oldest object in the archive, this one from May 1828, is about Van Diemen's Land, the lieutenant governor, allotting land for the Jewish burial ground upon the request of Mr. Bernard Walford. Walford, a convict sentenced at the Old Bailey in 1789, came to Van Diemen's Land via Norfolk Island and was the first to be buried at the what's called the Harrington Street Burial Ground in 5 months after this article in 1828. Now, for an introduction to the setting around this time, Rabbi L.M. Goldman wrote a very long article for the Australian Jewish Historical Society back in 1951. And this is the first paragraph. Very first sentence, as you can see, says, life in the early days of the convict settlement of Van Diemen's Land was hard and rigid. And then he talks about famine, bushranging, and martial law. As the paragraph concludes, among the convicts were Jews. The first fleet was in 1803, and there were convict Jews on that ship. Now, the first free settler to settle in Van Diemen's Land was Henry Davis, who came from Sheerness in 1822. And we'll talk more about Sheerness later. So there's a mix of convicts and free settlers for much of the early days of the Tasmanian Jewish community. So this is a letter written to the Australian Israelite newspaper in 1872 from Mr. Everett Isaacs, a free settler from London, who was one of the original congregation members and sang in the choir at the synagogue's consecration in 1845. Now, this letter is quite important, particularly this passage here. He provides invaluable details of how the congregation was formed. Isaac says that when he arrived in Hobart Town in 1842, he came at the same time as many young Jews, and he was surprised to see that there was no synagogue. Then he called a meeting at the house of Isaac Freeman, who we'll cover soon, and Lewis Nathan, the congregation's first president, then took charge and called a meeting attended by every Jew in town and rallied for a community to raise a subscription to build a synagogue. Now, there were many Jewish convicts that were transported from 1803 to when transportation stopped in 1852. It's suggested here by Everett Isaacs that the Jewish free settlers were the ones who provided the organization to properly form a community. Now, based on the previous letter explaining how the congregation began, I think it's a good idea to take some time here to feature some of the key colorful personalities that helped establish the congregation. And here we'll start with Lewis Nathan. Lewis Nathan from London came to the colony as a free settler in 1834. He was a very successful import-exporter who also owned whaling ships. He was in business with his brother-in-law, Samuel Moses, who once again we'll cover shortly. Now, Lewis was elected president of the congregation in January 1842 and was highly involved with the establishment of both the congregation and the synagogue. Now, these are snippets from an article from a Hobart newspaper in 1847 arguing for support of Baron Rothschild, the first practicing Jew to sit as an MP in the British House of Commons. As you can see in the first two snippets, there's acceptance and admiration for Jews. And the article ends with reflecting the warm feelings towards Jews in the colony, with particular admiration for Lewis Nathan, our universally respected fellow citizen, a better member the people could not have. So Lewis's wife, Harriet, was unfortunately one of the few Jewish ladies in the 19th century that we know much about. She founded the Tasmanian Hebrew Benevolent Association in 1847, and right after the synagogue's consecration, she presented a paroshat to the synagogue as detailed in this Meena minute above. So Lewis went back to England in 1848 and soon retired from professional life. He was very active in Jewish affairs, as you can see here on the right, serving as warden of the Great and Central Synagogues and supporting many other Jewish groups causes, as you can see on the right. So Samuel Moses, he was Lewis's brother-in-law and business partner. Now this painting of Samuel is not physically in the congregation's archives. In fact, it sold in Melbourne in 2016 for over $170,000 Australian dollars, and after being held by descendants for over a century and a half. Now, Samuel was a leader for the Jewish community. He was the moil for the entire colony and traveled around the state performing this ritual. Now, in 1845, he circumcised Josiah Solomon's 20-year-old son, performing the operation in a very scientific manner in about 2 minutes, the patient undergoing the operation without a murmur. I'm not sure what's more impressive, the fact that Samuel Moses did this so well or that the patient did not even have a murmur. So here is Samuel Moses' obituary in the Jewish Chronicle, which was republished in the Australian Israelite in 1874. Note, the second excerpt says that when Moses and his brother-in-law, Lewis Nathan, came to Tasmania, Jews were rapidly sinking into oblivious past all those rites and ceremonies which have made Israel, by the divine blessing, the one and peculiar people. And also notice at the top, it says that Samuel Moses was laid in the fields of Willesden, and Samuel was the first to be buried at the famous Willesden Cemetery. Now on to Josiah Solomon. He was convicted for hiring thieves to repossess stolen goods in Sheerness in the UK, and his death sentence was commuted to life in the colony. Judah and his brother Joseph quickly found success in Van Diemen's Land, running a shop and various business activities. They built the mansion pictured here, Temple House, so named because services were held in Temple House before the synagogue was built. Now, Judah did not get a divorce before being transported. He took up, when he went in Van Diemen's Land, he took up with his housekeeper, and things seemed to be going pretty well for Judah until his wife, Esther, surprised him by arriving in the colony in 1832. Esther fought against Judah's wish to get a divorce and had a successful letter writing campaign to prevent Judah from going to England to obtain a divorce or receive a pardon. Now, Judah was a member of the congregation, serving as treasurer, and most importantly, he donated his garden as land for the synagogue, which is a little bit over there. Now, Temple House is 2 doors down from the shul. It remained in the family until the 1920s when it was sold to the YMCA. The police and the government own it now, and it was restored in the 1990s to have a similar exterior to the photo above. The next time you're in Hobart, be sure to check out this building in conjunction with your visit to the synagogue. You can't actually go inside, but you can see the lovely outside. Now, Phineas Moss, he was born in Portsea in Hampshire in 1795. He came to the colony in 1835, and his first job was a clerk in the central Tasmanian town, Bothwell. Phineas was the first Jewish public servant in Australia. He later moved to Hobart and continued work as a clerk and also worked as a bookseller. Now, if Phineas lived now, I think he would be best suited to work at a university. He was a popular lecturer for various groups on subjects such as astronomy and maths. He published a paper with the Royal Society of Tasmania entitled The Science of Astronomy Among the Ancient Jews. In 1853, he arranged to have printed in London the first Jewish calendar for Australia in the Hebrew and English languages. And I think this was digitized by the State Library of Victoria, and here's an excerpt. He served as congregation secretary for several years and organized the congregation's library. Now, at this point, you may be starting to think that all our early members were from England. While the vast majority were, there were certainly some exceptions. Isaac Freeman, he was the first Hungarian in Australia. He was born in Budapest in 1805, and Isaac was a devout Jew who first settled in Sydney and then came to Hobart Town in 1840. At this time, he served as a publican, and his house/inn was the site of an 1842 meeting where it was decided to build a synagogue. We actually went over up briefly before. So here's the Meena minute. It's a little difficult to read, but somewhere it says it was also proposed that Mr. J. Solomon and seconded by Mr. Philip Levy, who also we just went over, that some place be procured for the purpose of making a synagogue. Unfortunately, that motion was carried. And Isaac later pursued a career as a shachet. So this is a Meena minute from 1844. And again, back to Philip Levy. As you could see underlined here, the fellow congregant and future president Philip Levy suggested that Isaac ran a brothel. Must have been a bit of a heated meeting. So on the left here, we have an ad for Isaac Freeman's butcher shop, which was a couple doors down from the synagogue. And on the right, we have another Meena minute excerpt. And in the middle here, you could see that and Mr. Samuel Levy accused Isaac of making sausages on Shabbat. And perhaps because of these various conflicts, Isaac eventually moved to Sandhurst in the Victorian Goldfields, which I'm sure you know is now known as Bendigo. And there he served as Hazan and Shachet. So David Hechter, he was a founding member of the congregation from Denmark. He was the original resident of this lovely house north of Hobart, which is literally around the corner from my house where I'm speaking right now. The architect for this building was a Scottish convict, James Alexander Thompson, who also designed the Hobart Synagogue. And finally, this is Abraham Rubin. He was born at 65 Whitechapel Road in London and was sentenced to transportation at the Old Bailey in 1827 and arrived at the age of 16 in the colony. He went on to become a very successful produce merchant in Hobart and was one of the founding members of the congregation. And unlike many of the other original members, he stayed in Hobart and eventually becoming a city alderman and died in Hobart. So that's a sample of some of the more interesting personalities. Let's start to get into more of a sequential look at the original material found in the collection that tells the stories. So here we have a newspaper article from 1839 detailing Hobart's town Jews gathering at Israel Hayam's Rosencrown Inn for Yom Kippur. This was 6 years before the synagogue opened. And as you could see in the article, and hopefully it's clear enough for you to read, it states there was an application made that Jewish prisoners in the barracks be allowed to attend this service. There was only one Jew who was actually allowed to attend. It's explained here. The article is complimentary of this and says it shows that the system of prison discipline is also gradually improving. So there's a lot to take from this article. So this is a transcription of one of the very first Meena minutes from 1841. It's impressive just how organized and structured things were even back then. They took this quite seriously. I wish our congregation meetings was this organized. So in August 1843, there was a ceremony for the laying of the foundation stone of the synagogue. In attendance were, of course, the committee of management and also James Alexander Thompson, the synagogue's architect. The article also details how the president of the congregation, Louis Nathan, had a sealed bottle that contained a list of subscribers to the building fund and information on the building, all on parchment paper. And this bottle was deposited in the cavity of the foundation stone and is certainly still there. How to retrieve this without causing some damage, I don't know, but it's nice to know that it's still there. It'd be very interesting to one day be able to get it, but might be easier said than done. So the synagogue was consecrated on 4 July 1845. There's an incredible amount of information in the archives about this event. We have Meena minutes planning and reviewing the big day, the order of service, an original ticket, the sheet music, and newspaper articles such as this with elaborate detail. So this is an excerpt from a newspaper article that goes over building details. Oops, I did not do that. The splendid chandelier, the commandments upon tablet of marble, the cedar seats, each ornamented with a Masonic double triangle. So here's a recent photo of the synagogue where you could see all these things almost 177 years later. The chandelier, the cedar pews, and might be a little hard. Oh, you could see the commandments on marble up there. And here we have what was described as the Masonic double triangles. So numbers on the back of each seat, and historically members paid for a seat hire, where they essentially bought the use of a seat and had their very own seat identified with a number. Now with the digital archives, it's challenging to draw users in with accessible stories about our history in general. There may be specific records an experienced researcher is able to retrieve, say for family history, but it's also important to provide a gentle overview of our history. I understand the archive may be overwhelming for those who are new to our history. So to try to address this, I created exhibitions, which were basically a collection of records by a theme or event with a description. So this exhibition is for the consecration with some of the objects just mentioned. Like here we have the order of service, the sheet music, which is that one, and a photo of the original ticket for the consecration. Now here's a photo of the synagogue illustrating the Egyptian revival style. You could see the trapezoid windows and the cornices, pillars. Now we're often asked about why this style was used, as it's not exactly common for synagogues worldwide. And I'm never quite sure how to answer that because it wasn't documented. Now, just a few months ago, we received research from a local architect here in Hobart that shows that the synagogue's architect, James Alexander Thompson, had a folio book of engravings of the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly in London, constructed in 1812, and it was torn down in 1905. Now, there are a lot of similarities with the synagogue, as you could see. So we have the trapezoid windows and the cornices, if you could compare the two, are somewhat similar. And we have the pillars, columns. Fortunately, the synagogue doesn't have these on them, but and we also have these like poles, I guess best word to describe it here, and you could see them there. So it's pretty safe to assume that the Egyptian hall had quite an influence on the synagogue's architecture. What we don't know is if the congregation was involved with this decision. Now, there's nothing in the Meena minutes or any other documents that, reflecting that the congregation said, hey, we've done some research and we want our architect to do an Egyptian style as opposed to, say, Gothic. It would be lovely if that existed. So there's still, even though we have an idea of the inspiration, we still don't know exactly what was behind it. Now, in the early days, the congregation sometimes wrote to Chief Rabbi Nathan Adler for advice. Here, as detailed in the Meena minutes, it was asked if the convict pass holders could be counted towards a minyan and receive honors. The answer was that yes, they are to be counted towards a minyan, but they're not allowed to receive honors. So here's Ike Solomon's death record from the congregation records. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Ike lived quite an adventurous life and was the subject of somewhat recent books and movies. It's been put forward that Ike was the basis for Charles Dickens' Fagin and Oliver Twist. But as I will show at the end of my presentation, there's also a belief that another Van Diemen's Land Jew was the model for Fagin. Now, I find that Hobart's Jewish history is marked by many different phases of ups and downs. The early years were certainly a bright spot. Not only were there many Jews around, the 1854 census showed 454 Jews in the colony. There was much excitement about forming the community and the consecration of the synagogue. Plus, as we saw, there were several well-known local personalities. The latter part of the 19th century was a period of decline. The Jewish population sunk mainly due to better opportunities on the mainland. And after several ministers that stayed only for a few years, the congregation had no minister. Now, there are very few newspaper articles about the community from around 1870 to like 1900, presumably because there was little activity. By the 1880s, there were also no meeting minutes, most likely because there were no meetings being held. And here we could see a newspaper article as early as 1872. There's a report about Rosh Hashanah, and it's stating that the community has dwindled down to a very small number, yet seats were occupied by every Jew in Hobart Town. So this description of a tiny but devoted congregation comes up many times. Now the 1891 census shows a total of 84 Jews for the entire island, down from 232 in 1870 and 454 in 1854. And at this time, there's only 43 Jews left in Hobart. It's quite a drop. The 454 in 1854 was our peak in the island, and only time will tell if we'll ever get back there. Now, another theme in the archives are visitors leaving some colorful comments about our tiny community. These letters are from 1900, and they're from Australian Jewish publications, I think either the Jewish Herald or the Hebrew Standard. So on the left, underlined, we see, it says, the majority of Jews living there never see anything of Judaism, and their children are brought up in total ignorance of its precepts. They marry out of the faith and gradually become entirely lost to it. And on the right, we have another letter saying, Hobart has a synagogue, but I found what was once a respected and healthy congregation dwindled down. Religious neglect predominates among the young men, and intermarriage is the rule rather than the exception. Judaism in these parts is in a most deplorable condition. Now on to Joseph Solomon. He was the son of Judah Solomon and Judah's housekeeper, and lived in the mansion Temple House next door to the synagogue, and was a very successful businessman, just like his father. He died in 1894, and he left £1,000 to the synagogue, which I believe was worth quite a lot. As we've gone over, the community was in a precarious pace at this time. There were barely any Jews around and no formed organization. And I think it's pretty safe to say, without Joseph Solomon leaving this money for the congregation, the synagogue might not be there today. So here's an article after his death at Temple House in 1894. The article concludes with his generous donations, £1,000 each to the synagogue, the hospital, and the Benevolent Society. So it took a while after Joseph Solomon's death, but with his very generous bequest, the congregation was able to reform after a down period in the late 19th century. Now, Judah Solomon's grandson, Samuel Benjamin, pictured on the left here, he grew up in Hobart and was living in America when he received a generous inheritance from the previous mentioned Joseph Solomon, his half-uncle. So Samuel, he came back to live in Hobart, in Temple House, in fact, and he subsequently led the Jewish community. Samuel also served as an alderman for the city of Hobart. So on the right here, we have a 1906 letter from Joseph Glasser, a pawnbroker living in Hobart. And he told the congregation secretary and reader, Henry Ansel at the time, that he would like to see a congregation formed on a sound basis, and you can reckon on me to become a member. And note that Joseph Glasser was the grandfather of Neil Glasser, who those of you in Sydney may be familiar with, particularly for Neil Glasser's work with the Queen Victoria Building. Now, the letters that are featured in this collection were all lined under the pews in storage for many years, the actual physical copies. A few years back, a fellow congregation member, Daniel Albert, and I went through the boxes, and there's lots of papers of little value, such as receipts, but we did find treasures like this that we have since handed over to the state archives, which they have digitized. So with the money left by Joseph Solomon, the congregation was able to employ a minister for the first time in decades. Reverend Isaac Morris came from Newcastle in New South Wales via Wales and Lithuania. He was a very popular figure both within the congregation and with the general public. Now these snippets are from testimonials to Reverend Morris, the first one on the right being at his farewell in 1921. He went back to Newcastle. And as you can see, the children in the community were grateful for the education they received from Reverend Morris, including Clyde Epstein, who was our long-term president into the 1980s. We'll go over Clyde later. Reverend Morris was our longest serving minister in history from 1910 to 1921. After his departure, we've had a few that stayed a very short time, and our last full-time minister was in the 1950s. So in 1904, the synagogue had a visit from Melbourne from Rabbi Dr. Joseph Abrams. He gave quite a moving sermon. He says, looking around at the boards and records of names in the synagogue, a beautiful vision was conjured up before the eyes of the activity of the past generation. And not only that, but of the fact there was something in Jewish religion and something in the Hebrew race that bound them together in such a way that they laughed at distances. It took no heed of the intervening oceans and continents. The names upon the boards were exactly the same as might be seen in the synagogue of any city in the world. The grand old Hebrew names were there: Abraham, Benjamin, Moses, Levy, etc. They would find those names in every synagogue and throughout Jewish records of every generation. Now, the early 20th century was a relatively thriving time for the congregation. There were only 12 adult members, though as you can see here, 80% attended Shabbat service. And it says they had a minyan every Friday night and Shabbat morning. Now, here's an unusual snippet from our Meena minutes from 1911. The committee devoted attention to suppress the annoyance during divine service caused by a Mr. G. George Levy, who was reading aloud and interrupting the minister, and also the manner in which he read the Kaddish, not allowing a mourner an opportunity to be heard. Now, the committee wrote a letter to George Levy through a law firm saying that he must stop the interruptions or stringent measures will have to be taken. Now, there was no follow-up with the legal action taken, so one can assume Mr. G. Levy, he settled down. Now, our collection of letters offer unique first-hand sources. In 1908, we received a gift of Jewish books from Julia Matilda Whaley Cohen, a member of the well-known London Whaley Cohen family. Now, the list of books, which was written to our then President Samuel Benjamin, are in this letter. It's nice to see specific examples. First, how Jews would provide assistance to other Jews on the other side of the world. And obviously, it's also very interesting to see what were considered important Jewish books in 1908. I'll let you take a little look at that. So the Diamond Jubilee in August 1918 was celebrated on the 75th anniversary of the laying of the synagogue's foundation stone. Now, the writing on the left is from the local paper, The Mercury, and shows it was quite the event, packed to the doors, and there were many members of the general public in attendance. On the right, you'll see here that our secretary, Nat Edwards, wrote that it is a source of intense satisfaction that as one of the management of probably the smallest congregation in the civilized world, that both our minister and the Jewish population of Hobart should be held in the very highest esteem. Now, those words are pretty powerful. Even over 100 years ago, just like today and many decades previous, they were challenged with numbers. However, there was pride and perseverance. Now, a unique development in Hobart around the time is there are many conversions being performed. And almost all of these conversions didn't involve Hobart congregants. Here we have Mr. Rupert Hart applying for his wife and child to be converted. Rabbi Dr. Joseph Abrams of Melbourne explained that for privacy reasons, he came to Hobart. So here is a glance of what was involved in the Hobart conversion process. There's an application accompanied by 2 references. That's a little different than the ideal conversion process we have today. And there is a fee at the bottom, which may explain a bit as well. Now, there are many examples in the Meena minutes of requests like this where 2 references were sufficient and a fee was collected, with the conversion often involving the wife of a Jewish male. There are also several records in the marriage register from people who are clearly interstate and not members of the congregation. And we actually have found that in the East Melbourne Hebrew congregations, Meena minutes, they censored the Hobart congregation for this practice. Now, reading all these old newspaper articles gives one appreciation for how journalism has evolved. So here's an article about a bar mitzvah in the synagogue. The son of the previously mentioned Nat Edwards, our secretary, and it's from 1915. So as you can see, the article on the left, it's fairly standard. It's just going over the ceremony. But then the second half of the article on the right, it's a close examination It's all just about the dresses that the female attendees wore. Apparently lots of linen and silk, very detailed. I find this bizarre, but I suppose it was pretty common for the time. So this is an article from 1926 after Samuel Benjamin, a well-known leader, passed away. And as you can see underlined, it says it was no fault of his that the disappearance of the Jewish population of Hobart, or at least of Jews who took an interest in their religion, made it the fight that he fought a losing one. So those are strong words. After some prosperous years, the congregation is again struggling. So here's our president's report in 1936. And as you can see underlined, the future does not look bright. So in an era where news traveled slower, it's interesting to see what our tiny community in the safety of Tasmania thought of what was going on in Europe during the Holocaust. And there was concern, as you could see in the second paragraph here, referring to the shocking treatment, Jews stand aghast at the inactivity of nations that stand by and watch the attempted extermination of a race that has done so much for civilization. So after a nice stretch in the first quarter of the 20th century, this time around the 1930s was a downturn for the congregation. There was an AGM that had a measly 4 attendees. We're not talking about a board meeting, we're talking about an AGM that had 4 attendees. One of those attendants was Rubin Benjamin, and you have to admire his dedication. As you can see in this excerpt from the Australian Jewish Historical Society, Rubin took it upon himself to open the synagogue every Saturday for Shabbat, and he wouldn't leave Hobart so that he could ensure services would continue. As mentioned towards the end of the snippet, the Jewish community soon expanded with the arrival of European refugees. So Rubin ran a much-loved confectionery shop in Hobart for over 50 years. It was said that it was a shop of everyone's childhood, and Rubin was described as a good citizen and friend who made the shop a Hobart tradition. Now, the collection also holds places that's displayed on a map, and this shows Rubin's confectionery shop, which is on Liverpool Street. And as you might be able to see the Magen David there, the synagogue is a couple blocks over on the right. So on a serious note, this is a resolution that our congregation passed in 1940 that's in Meena minutes. A very cold welcome to fellow Jews escaping the horrors of Europe. I gave you a minute to read that. Unfortunately, this tension between those arriving from Europe versus the established Anglo-Jews was, what I understand was fairly common throughout Australia. I was told that many Anglo-Jews strive to be more British than the British. So as you can see here on the top, unfortunately that was rescinded 3 years later, and one of the newcomers, as they were referred to, newcomers, was Hans Jacob. He was from Germany, and he proudly served as president for many years in the 1940s and 50s. We had many active long-term members who arrived from Europe around that time. Now, the original Jewish cemetery was first established in 1828. In the 1870s, Hobart consolidated all the local cemeteries in one bigger ground, and we were given a part of the new Cornelian Bay Cemetery to establish a Jewish burial ground. At Harrington Street, the old Jewish cemetery was maintained until the land was sold in the 1940s to the state government. So back to the collection, there are many death records for people buried at Harrington Street. A new addition to the collection, just a couple, maybe last month, were the tombstone inscription for many of the burials at Harrington Street. Now, in the 1890s, a local Quaker here went to many of the old cemeteries around Hobart and recorded the tombstone inscriptions, and it was kept in a notebook of his, and it was eventually handed over to the state archives. And just like last month, I contacted state archives and paid a very small fee to have them transcribe these handwritten inscriptions. And I asked the volunteer, Jeff Court, to type out these inscriptions, and now, which you kindly did, and now they are found in many of the Harrington Street death records, as you can see here. And Jeff's wife is Sarah, the subject here, Sarah Cohen, who was buried, and this is her inscription. Jeff's wife is Sarah Cohen's 3 times great-granddaughter. I'm not sure if Jeff is actually here today. He was invited, but Jeff has done extensive research on Sarah Cohen's family and found within their collection an essay. Found within the collection is an essay he wrote about the story of Sarah Cohen and her family. Now, when the congregation sold the land to the state in the 1940s, this message was conveyed in a letter to the state. It said that none of the tombstones at Harrington Street were of any value except Bernard Walford, who requested the establishment of the cemetery, as we went over in the beginning of this presentation. Similar to abandoned non-British subjects in the 1940s, I feel this is terrible to read. How could you have such disrespect to fellow Jews and congregants that were buried there? Now, public housing went up at the old cemetery, and many tombstone and remains were still there, and to be blunt, were not treated with respect. When a second round of public housing went in around the year 2000, there was archaeological work that were done, and remains and remnants of the old tombstones were collected and reinterred at the current Jewish burial ground at Cornelian Bay. Excuse me. So in 1947, the tension between the established Anglo-Jews and the recent arrivals boiled over to the Australian Jewish Herald out of Melbourne. On the left, we have an article that appeared in the Herald. Ferry Fixel, who came from Austria, says that the shul today is in the care of recent arrivals. The Australian Jews have almost without exception intermarried and forgotten their Judaism many years ago. Now, Victor Coronel here on the right, he wrote a letter a week later, I think. And Victor Coronel is president of the congregation. He was obviously angry about this, as you could see highlighted. He said, the fact is, if it was not for these Australian Jews, a number of whom lacked the opportunity to marry someone of their faith, there would not have been a synagogue in Hobart. And then he goes on to say, it's the Australian Jews who are responsible for maintaining the shul. So this tiny community seemed divided into 2 groups. Now, this is an article from the Australian Jewish Herald from 1952, written by Jewish communal leader Walter Lippmann. The article is calling on Australian Jews to support the Hobart congregation, particularly with the challenges of the upkeep of the synagogue. Now, on the right, we see some alarming details about the condition of the synagogue. It's talking about broken windows. They can't be repaired. The curtain of the Alma Mater is torn, and it's been like that for a while. So pretty sad details. Now, I should take this opportunity to thank the Australian Jewish Historical Society, particularly the president, Peter Phillison, OAM, who arranged for the digitization of so many Australian Jewish newspapers that can be found on Trove. Now, certainly related in 1955, again, Hans Jacob, he tried to get creative and fundraising for the congregation in order for building repairs and to keep the minister at the time, Reverend George Rubin. There are a series of little articles like this in the Australian Jewish press where he is asking for, quote, mainland members to give money for the congregation. Now it says, if they lose the minister, our few children will grow up with no knowledge of Judaism whatsoever, and all the fight of survival, which our handful of Jews did down here over the last 18 years, will have been in vain. Now, Reverend Rubin did leave for Perth, and the congregation hasn't had a minister since. Just not many more slides to go here. Clyde Epstein, he was the subject of several articles in the Australian Jewish News in the 70s and early 80s. He was president and tireless campaigner for the congregation and often called for more support from the mainland. He was a bookmaker and often called into the local casino in search of Jewish tourists to come visit the synagogue. And this is his obituary in 1983 from the AGN. And also on the right, we have a newspaper article about his bar mitzvah in 1916. So there are many articles in the Australian Jewish News in the 1970s with very similar themes, concern for survival. As you can see, a headline says near extinction. Here we have but mostly their Sabbaths are marked by 5 and most 6 men. We sit there hoping for more, but they never come. I'm 73 years old, 95% of our members are pensioners, and I'm not sure how much longer we can keep it on. Outlook is very dim and even tolling towards eventual, or could be tolling towards eventual extinction. So I have much sympathy and respect for what Clyde faced, but I do have to say there's a bit of satisfaction reading this because thanks to Clyde's efforts and the dedication of many after him, we're in a much better place now. While there's still countless challenges, the future is bright. We have lots of young families that have moved here recently, and in 2020, during COVID, there was much restoration work done to the synagogue building. For those familiar with stonemasonry, we repointed, which came out great, and so the building is in much better shape now, and we have a very diverse congregation with many different backgrounds. Our members come from all over the world, and we even have a couple of members that actually grew up in Hobart. Now, our service attendance hasn't improved all that much, and there's an ever-present struggle, though our lay leaders are very dedicated and do a fantastic job with limited resources. We offer many tours of the synagogue about the building and the history, so please call in when you find yourself in Hobart. Now, taking it to family history a bit, we often receive queries from descendants. I very much enjoy this. There are still new names that come in, and it's fun to research, particularly when we have some sort of record that we're able to provide to a descendant. It's very rewarding. So I'd like to quickly leave you with a bit of a research adventure. This article, this newspaper article, is from 1834 and just came up when I was just playing around with Trove, searching for Jewish burial ground. So here we have a poor guy referred to as Worms. As you can see, was a convict who attempted to escape. There's something about the town New Norfolk and Brighton, and it gets to be quite gruesome. It's talking about how his body was found in the bush, dead of starvation, and animals carried off his remains. And the reason why this came up in my search is because, as you can see towards the end, his bones were collected and buried in the Jewish burial ground, the man being of that persuasion. So of course the question is, who's Worms? Our burial records started in the 1840s, presumably because the congregation was formed in 1841. So there were surely burials occurring, but it wasn't recorded because there was no congregation at the time. So I consulted the book that I'm sure everyone's familiar with by Rabbi Levy. These are the names. And there's an entry for a Henry Worms without the extra E at the end. His convict record ends with the word run in the 1830s. So I was thinking maybe, just maybe, this is a match. Then I came across this online digital collection of convict records showed that Henry Worms absconded in 1833 and received the pass at Brighton and New Norfolk, which were the two towns mentioned in the newspaper article. So the dates and the locations are seeming to match. Then through a simple Google result, I found that there's a blog run by a rare book dealer in the UK, Lawrence Worms, and he has an entry about his relative Henry Worms that he said was sent to Tasmania in 1833, went on the run and was never found and was still untraced in 1841. And as you can see, there's speculation, this was a new belief, that Charles Dickens knew of Worms and he was the model for Fagin from Oliver Twist. I eventually found an actual academic that was making the case that Worms was the model for Fagin. So I contacted this guy, the descendant Lawrence Worms, and he is convinced that that little newspaper article that I showed you at the beginning solves the mystery of what happens to Henry Worms as the details match. And it just goes to show some of the adventures you can find yourself on, all started with a mysterious, gruesome newspaper article. So sorry, I went a bit over time. Thank you so much for letting me share the details of the archive, and I hope you enjoyed it. Again, here's the archive's website, my name and email address. Please, if you have any queries or need assistance about building and sharing any type of online collection, please let me know. I really believe these records should be shared on the internet and made very accessible for the world to see. Of course, I can't go without mentioning these are the names for Rabbi John Levy that, of course, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. You could purchase from Melbourne University Press. It was certainly used as a reference to help clarify some of the records to the people in early years. And I will open it up to questions now.
There have been quite a lot of comments congratulating you, Jeff, and also comments from people recognising their ancestors or relatives. A couple of questions that perhaps you might be able to answer. I assume there are probably not many photographs of the people that you go into these, into your website in searching, but a question asked, are there any photos of people generally?
Yeah, look, I mean, particularly in the 19th century, in the early days, for obvious reasons, it's not common for photos to exist. We do have that great one of Abraham Rubin. Yeah, I mean, there have been some like, that I've seemed to be like in the public archive that I have collected and shared. Yeah, and for the 20th century one, I mean, there were various ones found like in newspaper articles and all that I was able to share. But yeah, I mean, I guess where I've been able to find them, I put them in. But a lot of times the photos just are not known.
Danny Haskey asks, can collective access be used by an individual, or is it more an institutional software?
No, I mean, look, it's open source and free. So it does take a, I mean, I'll be completely honest, my background as a web developer certainly helps with it. But it can certainly be used for an individual if you have the time and effort to be able to set it up. I suppose the challenge, it does take a bit more time in the early stages to get it configured, right? You do have the flexibility where you can configure it however you want, but unlike some other similar software, it's not as simple just to get going right away. It takes a bit more building in the beginning.
I think it's amazing, absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
Is there anyone, Paul Gardner, I think you want to ask something.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's wonderful, Jeff. You mentioned Josiah Solomon as an important early person in the Hobart congregation. He had numerous descendants, and some of them many of them are still alive. Can I recommend this book to you? It's by Michael Cohen, who's a descendant of Judah Cohen. I don't know if you know of this book.
Yeah, I think I took some photos. I took a photo of the marble plaque for Josiah Solomon. I think someone who was helping Ian Greenblatt, I think was his name.
Yes.
Yeah, he asked me to take a photo of the marble tablet for Josiah Solomon on the wall of the synagogue. So it may or may not appear in the book. I haven't actually had a copy yet.
Well, the book is not only a marvelous piece of genealogical research, it's also got, it's very much autobiographical and also places it in the historical context. So, I can recommend the book. Michael's a friend and colleague of mine, and I think it's a very nice story of one of the outcomes of the Hobart congregation.
Thank you. Yes, I will certainly try to check it out. Yep.
Terry asks whether or not there are similar sort of resources from Launceston, which is a bit far away from you, I appreciate.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's 2 hours up the road. I mean, I certainly have come across information about Launceston while within the Hobart records, and I know a little bit about it, but the Hobart records occupy my time, and I haven't, I'm not sure if, I don't know of the birth, marriage, and death records from Launceston. I don't think they exist, or if they do, I'm not sure where they are. We're very fortunate in Hobart that those records were preserved, and now that we have them over to the State Archive and digitized, I haven't seen an equivalent for Launceston.
Is there anyone else that would like to ask one live? Because most of the other comments are congratulatory, and I thought it was a wonderful presentation, but
thank you.
If there are no other questions, Helen, go ahead.
I was just going to, I mentioned it in the chat. As it happened, I actually transcribed the Hebrew, the the birth records of the Tasmanian Hebrew congregation, and I transliterated the Hebrew names. So I've got almost all of them, and I can send that to you.
Oh, great. That would be wonderful. I'll just, yeah, if you're able to send them over, then I can add them to the site. Yeah, that would be great. We actually had, I think his name was Kevin Sekel.
Sekel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, Kevin was able to, he was one of the volunteer Meena minute transcribers, and he was, in the early days, a lot of our, there were little parts of our Meena minutes by our secretary Phineas Moss that were actually in Hebrew, and Kevin was able to just like put the in the transcriptions, just seamlessly put the Hebrew inside, which I really appreciated. So yeah, if we're certainly able to you know, just display Hebrew within the metadata records as well. So that would be great. Thank you.
You then sent me some articles about my grandfather, Reverend Leon Gorin.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I remember.
Tasmania after Rabbi Morris left.
Yes.
And I just want to know, I mean, the family, there are so many different family stories, it's silly. Is there any minutes where he was mentioned? Because he didn't stay, and yet my Aunt Bessie, I believe, was born in Hobart.
Yes, so I think when Reverend Goring came in, the minutes, they were a bit, there weren't that many, maybe like once every, they didn't seem to be meeting much. There were maybe once every couple months. I'll have to check. I'll definitely get back to you. Yeah, because I certainly believe there are minutes around that time. For whatever reason, there's much more about Minister Rubin, who was in the 1940s and 50s, probably because I think there was a bit of tension between the congregation and Reverend Rubin. There was a lot more in the minutes about him. But I'll definitely have to check and see what else I can find about Reverend Gorin.
And the other thing I want to tell you is Phineas Moss, was he related to the Moses, the 3 convicts that went? Because there's a Phineas Moss that is known down in Ulladulla. I have got heaps and heaps of historical records about the Moses family, because Michael Moses was the first person to ever make matzahs in Hobart. He was a patissier, you know, a patisserie chef. He used to cook for Governor Franklin.
Oh.
And I have all these records here, and I would love to give them to somebody.
Well, I'll certainly take them if you have them. But as far as I know, Phineas Moss, he was not related to anyone, any Moses. I mean, I know there's been examples where people use the name Moss and Moses sort of interchangeably, but certainly I haven't seen anything that.
Right. Okay. Well,
I think he just came on his own.
Well, Michael Moses, who was the pastry chef, had a son. He became the first mayor of Nowra.
Oh, okay.
So there's a whole connection all the way down through Goldman and Cooma. Abraham Moses was the first man to run the Cobb & Co coach between Goldman and Cooma. There's a whole lot of historical records that relate to the Moses family, because there were the 3 brothers, and then Abraham came out as a free settler. And there's a few graves in a little cemetery in Goldman from the wives, because there was a very sad story there. So I don't know whether you're interested in it, but there's a lot of sort of social stuff. But it all relates to this area, not so much to Hobart.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But anything on Hobart you have, I'd be interested in.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Deanne, I think we've got one marriage that Reverend Gorin did in Hobart in I think it was in 1922.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, December 1922. In those days, they didn't do many marriages in Hobart. So if he was only there a few years, he wouldn't have had the opportunity of doing many marriages.
No, I want to know if my Auntie Bessie was born there. So if I look at the website, I can track her.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes, there are some birth records from back then. If you send me an email, I'll take a look. Some of the ones from like the 20th century early bit has not been added to our website. But if you send me an email, I'll definitely check and give you a definitive answer.
Well, they left England in 1921, so it would have been 1922, 1923.
Yeah, and keep in mind that some, particularly, I think, you know, ironically, they were much better at keeping records in the early days than they were in the 20th century. So it's a bit irregular. Like the guy went over, Clyde Epstein, I know he was born in Hobart, but we don't have a congregation birth record for him for, I'm not sure why, but just seems that things were, they were just more meticulous in the early days, which.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. You've
Sure,
done a
thank you.
job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Barbara Simon. I'm sorry, Ephraim, you wanted to ask something.
Yes, Max. Jeff, when we were down there exhuming the bones that went to Chameleon Bay, and if you look at Harrington Street Cemetery, on the right-hand corner at the back, in the backyard, there is a tombstone as a retaining wall.
Yeah.
Was that ever picked up?
I don't know about that specifically. I mean, I did read the article in the Australian Jewish Historical Society by the archaeologists that it was talking about how they used. I mean, it's really horrible how they used the tombstones for like garden beds and stuff.
Yeah.
And I know
and even Jeff, when we were leaving the site, our labour at the was clearing along the back fence, and one of the neighbours said, "Are those stones going to be left there?" We said, no, we're taking them.
Yeah.
But that tombstone should be photographed, because the stupidity of the non-Jews there, he had the writing on the outside, not hidden by the soil. And that should be reclaimed.
Yes, I mean, I didn't know that something still existed. I mean, I live pretty close to it, so I'm happy to take a look and see if I could see what I can find. But
you need to ask me, I've got a lot of photographs. Okay.
Well, I just want to thank you for your work you did there. I mean, it was a messy situation, but it seems like, you know, we did the best thing we could at the time. It was before my time in Hobart.
It was good with Parry, the archaeologist, because he stood with us, because it was a little bit hard trying to get everybody on board to do the right thing.
Yeah.
But once we got it right, it was good. There was nearly a fight on the site one day between Parry and the foreman for the government building. And Parry told him, if I see you in a grave, I'll flatten you.
Oh, okay.
Thanks, Ephraim, for your input. I'm now going to pass over to Barbara Simon, President of the Sydney, or Australian Jewish Genealogical Society, brackets Sydney. Please go ahead, Barbara.
Thank you very, very much. And Jeff, thank you. And on behalf of both our societies, it's wonderful to have held a combined event. And one of the lines that you used during your presentation that you found was that that person was held in very high esteem. We hold you in very high esteem for what you have done. And I thank all the people that are on this call who helped be a part of this. But without somebody like you leading this, it would not be possible. I hope that we can collectively come down, enjoy your synagogue, be a part of your community for a short time, and share the amazing work that you've done. And for that, we thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
It's just reminding everyone that this has been recorded and will be available to members of both societies or anyone else that's interested. Thank you very much.